going, you guys?
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Let's just jump right into it because I know we've got a little bit of time pressure, but let's just go. Maybe let's start with Mike, right? Everyone knows Mike from Clickable Impact, but I'm sure you also know him from Vietnam Weekly. So in your second day job, right, as a journalist, how do you spot greenwashing or greenwashing or green crowding or green whatever, like the 50 Shades of Green? And how do you evaluate if the subject of your story is engaging in these activities?
Yeah, it's tough. And I will say I very rarely kind of cover individual companies, so it's not something I do too frequently. So I guess I'll answer this with both journalism and Clickable Impact hats on. But I think as a journalist, I mean, you're trained to be professionally skeptical, so I suppose I kind of have some skepticism towards most claims going in. It doesn't mean I don't believe them, but which is a challenge for companies in greenwashing, I think is also kind of it's one of those adjectives where the burden of proof is on the company. Because you can kind of just be like, well, you might be greenwashing without really defining what that means. And then it's kind of on the company to prove that they're not. But that's where a lot of the communications come in, which is where Clickable and Vero also work. So trying to, on the company side, defining what your goals are and how, and if they can be achievable. But it's as a journalist or even at Clickable, it can be hard because a lot of businesses don't have, we were just talking about measuring, don't have the capacity to measure their impact. This is an investor conference, so that leaves opportunities for investors who are maybe offering MRV solutions, for example. I've been thinking of the hospitality industry, for example, where kind of in my day-to-day life, that's maybe where I see the most examples of companies attempting to reduce their impact. And I'm sure large organizations like Accor, for example, probably have ways to measure their impact. But if it's a independent hotel or maybe a Vietnamese company, for example, they probably don't have that same capacity. And I have thought, you mentioned green lighting, which was a new concept to me, but when you say at a resort, and they have the little card that says, if you don't want your towel washed today, hang it back up. I don't know how much impact that has, especially if it's a place that has 50 villas, each with its own pool. That being said, I'm not going to get a reception and be like, can your manager tell me exactly how much water is reduced by my towel not being washed today? But it's a challenge, I will say. I mean, again, some large companies may have the numbers if you ask for them, but most don't. So I would say I generally approach it with a degree of skepticism. Not to say I don't believe companies, but I think that's good for all consumers to approach this topic with.
Yeah, I think a healthy dose of skepticism in most things is useful. But I enjoy the fact that you were talking about measurement, right? So I wanted to ask Amandine as well, how do you, at Circulate, how do you articulate the performance of your investments, of your projects? What are you measuring? How do you measure? How do you talk about the results and reports?
Yeah, sure. So Circulate Capital is an impact investment firm dedicated at advancing the circular economy and fighting plastic pollution in South and Southeast Asia. So our mission is to scale the solutions and businesses that will both generate financial returns as well as generate environmental and social value. We're convinced that our portfolio companies will strengthen their financial performance thanks to their strong impact. And how do we measure it, actually? And how do we work with them on this? And how do we communicate about it? So, of course, the first thing is to set up clear objectives. And we have done a lot of work on just the definition of these objectives and the KPIs that will support these objectives. And very important is that we are guided by two principles, and our first principle is transparency. So all these goals and KPIs are available on our website. And then second principle is impact. Is impact management, meaning that beyond transparency and beyond collecting this data, reporting on it on a quarterly basis to our investors, reporting on it publicly on an annual basis through our annual report, we do really manage this strategy, meaning that it's not just a matter of communication and just the glitter around your work. It's really about, it has to be core to your strategy. So we sit with this data, we review it, we discuss it internally, we discuss it with our portfolio company, and we potentially reassess our investments if we see that the correlation between financial and impact weakens over time. So it's really something that I want to highlight. Is, for me, fighting greenwashing is also related to how you value the importance of impact in your business strategy.
Yeah, I really like that, because so we're in the business of communications, right? I think arguably all three of us, and maybe some of us in the audience here, but our work as communicators when it comes to this particular industry, right? It's helping, it's a tool to amplify what the sustainability team is doing. It has to be at the core. It has to be, I think Ellen said at the previous panel just now, she said, take action. It has to be about the action that companies are taking. And once the actions are in the right place, the goals are set, and we're taking the right actions, we're taking the right steps, then we can talk about it, right? But actually, Amandine, in your experience, what are your observations about the companies that you are working with regarding their knowledge about talking about the stuff that they do, right? I know you work with a lot of great companies, especially in Southeast Asia, who might not know that they're even in like the impact industry.
Yeah, exactly. And as you said, Mike, it requires resources. So we do recognize that as investors. And so I would say the first thing we look at, beyond, of course, the business model of a company that we would assess for potential investment, is really also the mindset. Because it's a matter of commitment, and it's a matter of recognizing again that this shall be part of your business strategy. It's not a side project with a sustainability team. It's the responsibility of each of the team members. It has to be part of each job description. And so we do recognize our investments, our portfolio companies are small and medium companies. So they don't have like reporting teams. They don't have that. So we do work with them once on technical assistance, making sure that they put in place the realistic systems to collect the data and to be able to report it to us, to review this data and to challenge it to make sure that it's realistic and reflecting the reality of their work on the ground. But the key thing is that before we sign the contract, we make sure that they realize that this is a real commitment, and we are very serious about this, and so we want our portfolio companies to be as well, meaning that when we will do the hard work of putting all these systems in place, we will not have to convince them on the why. We can work on the what, on the how, but the why, we need to select the partners who are already convinced.
So we talked a lot about action, right? And I think to a certain extent, as communicators or as journalists, it's our role to a certain extent to galvanize a larger public, to sort of to inspire people into taking action. There are a lot of great community organizers in this industry that are holding companies and big firms accountable for some of the claims that they are making. But this is a very complex issue, right? So, Mike, actually, how would you sort of tread the line between wanting to inspire action, to galvanize the public, and something that's fair and contextual?
Yeah, so obviously within the context of Vietnam, galvanizing action is complicated. And I mean, to be perfectly frank, as a foreign journalist writing in English, I don't really expect to have much actual impact. A little bit, maybe on the fringe, but just speaking frankly. But within the actual thing I'm writing, I mean, of course, I have my own personal opinions about the climate and corporate action and all of that, but you do have to, or generally, traditionally in journalism, you do have to at least attempt to be objective. So I hope I'm doing that. But of course, there are times where it's difficult to not let your personal opinions seep in. You know, if I'm covering the Mekong Delta, for example, which was the previous conversation, it's really hard not to feel emotionally invested. And I mean, I'm not from Vietnam, obviously, but I've lived here quite a while, and it's hard to see what's happening there for a variety of internal and external reasons. So yeah, I think speaking for myself, again, if I can educate some people and maybe they could go try to galvanize some impact or drive some sort of change, I would consider that a success from my side. Also with my Clickable hat on as well. But yeah, I suppose if I could educate some other people enough to do something, then that would be doing a good job for myself at least.
Yeah, but context is really important, right? In our industry, I think for the last few years, everybody kept saying content is king, but actually context is king, and I don't know, more important than king, whatever that is, right? But so right now, you know, there's a lot of discussion about frameworks and guidelines and laws, and we're seeing progress maybe in other parts of the world or in selected countries in this region. But more often than not, these sort of frameworks and guidelines are developed in markets that have more time to think about ESG, to think about sustainability, to consider and reflect on their own growth against the impact that they're making. And so actually my next question is about context, right? Southeast Asia is very different. Do you think, let's start there first, do you think that there's a need for contextualized, tailored measurements, frameworks, guidelines for this part of the world? Mike?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, as you say, you know, the EU, for better or worse, drives a lot of these kind of global initiatives. So we've got coming down the pipeline the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, and also the EU deforestation regulation, both of which I think are supposed to come online next year, or various aspects of them. Very noble goals, but I think there's some valid criticism, no offense to my EU friends in the audience, that, you know, they're kind of pushing these requirements on markets that might not be developed enough to quite achieve them yet. You know, for example, coffee farmers in Vietnam will have to meet these requirements that they're not farming on land that was deforested within the last, I don't remember the exact year, but within some set amount of time. Great goal, but most farmers here are smallholders. It might be a family that has a couple of hectares of land, not much money. So that's hard for them to track. And if they don't have access to the EU market, that means less income for them. That's beyond those industries. So, and presumably the U.S. and other countries will eventually, other developed markets will eventually follow suit with similar regulations. So of course, it's good to combat deforestation in countries and across Southeast Asia. But I think there should be, I don't have an exact answer for how, but a bit more context for specific markets like Vietnam or Cambodia, Laos, these countries that are still developing quite rapidly, but still have some ways to go.
What about you, Amandine?
Yeah, from an investor perspective, these frameworks are critical because they help compare opportunities and compare an apple with an apple. But in order for an apple to be an apple, depending on the region, you have to put it in context. So terms like living income, what does it mean? What does it mean? It doesn't mean the same thing in France than in Vietnam. So this research around how do you put these definitions, these goals, which are all amazing goals. We are, of course, as an impact investor, we are aligned with the SDGs. We are signatories of the UN PRI. But how do we make it a reality here in Southeast Asia? So we do a lot of work with non-profit organizations, with universities, to be able to define this context and what do these definitions mean in the local context?
Yeah. So I'm hearing both of you agree that there is a need for contextualized frameworks and guidelines, right? That's communicated in a way that makes sense to the general public. Now, playing devil's advocate, right? Then how do we ensure global consistency? Because it's disingenuous, right? We're here talking about greenwashing. We're here talking about setting standards and goals and meeting them. And then we're saying, actually, it has to be different. Like, how do we balance that, in your opinion? Maybe Amandine first?
Yeah, so my take on that is that, again, we have to align on globally the why. Why is this framework important, and how can we achieve this global goal? But the KPIs, the how in detail has to be specific to the local context. So again, I'll take the example of the plastic recycling value chain in which we're working. It's we're currently having this debate with our partners on because of some of the EU regulations that if you're a recycling company in Vietnam or in Indonesia or in India, and that you supply your recycled materials to a global brand that will be exported to Europe, at some point you'll have to comply with some of the new directives on the supply chain transparency. And how do you prove that your plastic waste has been responsibly supplied? What does it mean? What does it even mean? This is where the issue of the definition of a living income came up. How do you define the living income of all these women in the streets of Ho Chi Minh City picking up the plastic bottles? Where is the threshold? What kind? And I don't have the answer. So again, this is something that needs to be defined together with the public authorities, with the universities, it's a complex issue. So however, to move forward, we need these global goals. They're critical, and we need accountability and all these global conferences that each year or every 2 years, convene all the key stakeholders to say, okay, where are we at? Because this is the North Star. However, we have to recognize that we need local groups, local communities working together on what does it mean for us? What does it mean in our context?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I also, kind of agree that their context is important, I'm not arguing for different outcomes. Like, all of these various frameworks should have the same outcome of, reduced emissions, reduced deforestation, all of that. But perhaps similar to what Amandine was saying, the implementation of those outcomes will be different for a region. And I don't know if that, so CBAM and EUDR, for example, are sticks, basically. If you don't follow these regulations, you're not selling to the EU. But there's no, at least to my knowledge, there's not a carrot of maybe the EU. Sorry, I'm calling out the EU here. I don't, just as it's a good example, but is there some sort of finance mechanism to maybe help these smallholder farmers meet these regulations? I know there are companies working on to help some of these industries. And I know the developed world kind of providing financing to the developing world is a fraught topic. But perhaps alongside these frameworks, there could be, and I know there's DFIs and international financial institutions, but some other sort of larger international fund to help meet these frameworks as they come online.
Interesting. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Southeast Asia because that's where we are. I think by all estimates, we are expecting exponential growth for Southeast Asia. This is really exciting. For me also, right, as a Southeast Asian, I am, from this land. I'm from the island, but whatever, details. And Southeast Asia is driving global growth, right? But from a communications perspective, right, well, before we go into communications, Southeast Asia at the same time is also one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world, right? And there's a lot of discussion around how can Southeast Asia balance growth against sustainability goals, right? But from a communication perspective, how do we approach that, right? Because I think logically people understand Southeast Asia needs to grow, right? This is a booming, there are booming economies here. There are people coming, to the cities. Growth is everywhere. You can feel the energy in this part of the world. But how do we then balance that need for growth and for sustainability? Amandine, maybe?
That's a big question. I think from an investment perspective, because we started our fund in this region and we see it as an opportunity, meaning that Southeast Asia is a powerhouse for production and consumption, giving the huge opportunity of putting circularity, because it's our focus, as a default. So how do we really make sure that each new product, each new business model can incorporate the end of life from the very beginning and not repeat the mistakes of the growth from the Western world for the last 50, 100 years? So from a communications perspective, I think it's really about, again, setting goals. And as you said in your introductory presentation, it doesn't have to be big, giant steps. It's really about being authentic and realistic, about being aware, and then making sure that one step at a time, we have a pathway, and we have a North Star, and we work collaboratively, and we need all hands of deck. So we need the government, we need the private sector, we need the non-profit sector. We need conferences like today. So it's really all actors have to play their part. We were discussing it with Raf earlier, journalists to be trained, to ask questions and to challenge and be skeptical. We need students to be skeptical and challenge. We need consumers to challenge. We need leaders in large companies to challenge the existing business models. So yeah, it's really all hands on deck.
When this is going to age me, but when I was a kid, I used to watch a cartoon and it's called Captain Planet. I don't know how many of you, when your powers combine, I am Captain Planet, right? That's such good messaging at the end of the day, right? As communicators, I think we can appreciate that's amazing messaging. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, and I also think on the communication side, I'm not saying it's easy to communicate all this in Southeast Asia, but I do think there is somewhat of an advantage for the region. Sorry. So I'm from the U.S., and insanely, in my view, climate has become this wildly politicized topic that is a complete third rail in many instances. We don't have that in Southeast Asia, or at least not in Vietnam. We're all living through it. Of course, every country is, but we just had this region-wide heat wave, which I think will go down as among the most severe in history up to this point, at least. Obviously, Vietnam is typhoons every year in central Vietnam. The Mekong Delta is worth saline intrusion every year. Thailand, Cambodia, all have their own challenges. So you don't really have this public resistance, or at least maybe half the public resistance to addressing climate. Again, it's not easy to find solutions to all of these things. Vietnam, for example, is still heavily reliant on thermal power, which it wants to move away from. That's difficult. But I think for public communication, at least, I think there is a lot of willingness to kind of embrace. There's still a lot of education and awareness raising to do, but there's not really that politicization of climate, which is good. I think an advantage, at least for communication.
And if I may add as well, something that's I realized by working with this fund for the last 5 years, and an exercise that we really like to do with our team is also communicating on the challenges that we're facing. We would all learn so much from sharing on our challenges and how the lessons learned on this. So we are, of course, all very shy to admit that we're facing challenges, but all organizations are. And in order to address these huge global challenges, we have to share the lessons learned step by step again. And so a very concrete example, I'm currently working on our annual report. And so I've been asking my team, can you report the highlights of last year as well as the lowlights? Yeah. And then I don't know if we will publish all of them, of course, but at least it generated a discussion internally about, oh wow, I didn't know you were challenged by that, and like how can we do it differently next year, or what kind of resource do you need, and like so. Please don't be afraid of sharing it internally, externally with some of your partners. It doesn't have to go in a press release, but the challenges, the lowlights, and if you can share it publicly, because it will, I think, help. We need to hear about the solutions, but we also need to hear about the gaps and the things that still need to be addressed.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And when you communicate the challenges, maybe someone else in another part of the world has the solution for what you're facing, right? And then something happens.
And from a communications perspective, it strengthens the credibility of your brand, and it builds trust with your partners. So even with our investors, they really appreciate it when we're being transparent. And we tell them, okay, we faced this issue, this is how we solved it, or this is how we are still struggling. And so I would really encourage, I think, each organization of thinking about that.
I think my next question is, how would you engage investors and also consumers in this region? But I feel like you've talked about it, right? It's being transparent. Like, transparency is extremely important. I don't know if you have anything else to add on how do you engage as an investor, as you know, from the fund side. How do funds or investors want to be engaged? How do they want to be communicated with? Or how would someone like you engage other investors so you can crowd in more and inspire more action?
Yeah, so I think on our sector, which is the circular economy for plastics, what we see, but I think it's true for other sectors, is that investors need to see track record of successful transactions and exits, track record, a solid pipeline of deals. And so this is what we're trying to demonstrate with Circulate Capital. And the third thing is that they need to see supportive market conditions and that de-risk the investments. So again, this is why transparency and trust are critical, because it will avoid any kind of bubble, and describing the potential in an accurate and specific way, rather than over-promoting the potential of your company or of your sector, and then deceiving your investor. I think that's the worst. So over-promising is the worst you can do with an investor. You have to set up realistic goals and communicate about it. And again, if you're facing challenging in achieving them, communicate about it as well.
It's powerful. Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And I guess building off that a little bit, I think being realistic, if you're a brand or any kind of organization, is key. I mean, people will be, if you set a small goal and meet it, like people will be quite happy with that. Whereas if you set some massively ambitious goal and completely miss it, then you're either left having to just like not even talk about it or come up with some reason why, and that's going to invite more skepticism and criticism. That's one thing Clickable can help an organization do, is like try to craft realistic goals that you could actually meet. Because I mean, Amandine kind of repeating what she said, but I think that's more important. If you can set achievable goals and achieve them, that'll get you a lot more credit with consumers as well, than if you like shoot for the moon and completely miss, which, I mean, everyone will do that, but it's better to do maybe incremental, especially if you're a smaller business organization or something like that.
Yeah, set the goals, meet them, and then talk about them authentically, right? I think we have questions. No, we don't. So I think we have. I was going to end, with another question, but I feel like this is the perfect spot to end where we are, right? Because Amandine talked about being transparent. Mike talked about being realistic, right? And if I were to end this panel in any way, and I always end most of the stuff that I do, is to say, well, don't be evil, right? It's okay if it's a small step. It's okay if we're all at the beginning of our journeys or whatever process that we are at our journeys. Let's talk about it truthfully. Let's be transparent. Let's be realistic. And let's talk about it truthfully. Let's just not be evil. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.